So Harrison is elected as a Whig, and really the purpose of the Whig Party is to come together and find a way to get rid of these Jacksonian policies. The Trail of Tears ended up being incredibly unpopular, even though most Americans wanted to acquire more land and territory and wanted to remove the natives from their land. So Harrison is elected and he serves for the next 4 years. Now, in the run up to the 1844 presidential election, Democrats really used this time to get together and regroup and form some kind of plan to take back the power that they held in the White House. And so they seize on this popular idea that the United States should expand outside of its current borders. Now, this is particularly interesting because remember, we as the United States have now purchased the Louisiana Territory, and we have in effect doubled the size of the nation. Then we have the battle for Texas or the Texas Revolution, and we acquire Texas from Mexico. And I use the term acquire there pretty loosely, but now we have expanded into this territory. So what the United States wants to do is to expand outside of the current borders that we have and end this joint occupation with the Oregon country, which has been shared by the United States and Great Britain since the end of the American Revolution. Now, Democratic candidate James K. Polk is going to run for election, and he will center his campaign on the expansion, specifically on the annexation of Texas and the reoccupation of Oregon. Now, he'll use these two ideas, this annexation and reoccupation, this strategy, he'll use this to beat the Whig candidate named Henry Clay, who was really uncommitted on the issue of Texas. The anti-slavery and anti-annexation Liberty Party does win enough votes in New York to give James K. Polk this majority. Now, the Liberty Party is really an interesting party because they form kind of based on some interesting principles. And I want to share with you their charter or their foundation, what they resolve. So the Liberty Party will demand the absolute and unqualified divorce of the general, meaning federal government, from slavery, and the restoration of equality of rights among men in every state where the party exists or may exist. Now, this is the foundation of the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party will continue to evolve in the coming presidential elections. Now, the annexation of Texas really takes place a month before James K. Polk is even inaugurated as the president. It takes place the day after Florida becomes a state. And at the same time, we have the expansion based on a vision of manifest destiny, which became the theme of Polk's administration. Now, manifest destiny is an interesting concept that we see developing post-revolution and even earlier in our nation's history. And it's really this doctrine or belief that the expansion of the United States throughout the American continents was both justified and inevitable. So ultimately, we argue that it's going to happen and it's absolutely justified that the United States should expand its territory as far and as wide as it can. Now, Polk's first move once he is elected president is to really focus on Oregon. And the reason for this is that until the 1840s, most Americans living in this area resided south of the Columbia River. And so what Polk wants to do is to acquire any territory that has a large British holding. More Americans began moving into Oregon in 1842, and they settled north of this Columbia River. And the British, of course, attempted to deter Americans from settling in this area. And this sort of rallies the nation and the president and results in a treaty that just sort of extends this line between British Canada and the United States to what is called the 49th parallel. Make sure you write that down, the 49th parallel. So we basically just sort of move the boundary a little bit. At the same time, we have population increases in the West, and this is really due to white migrations as well as the influx in Eastern tribes that transformed the unique relationships, the very fragile relationships with other natives in the area. Remember, some natives have already been pushed into this area, other natives have been pushed into places like Oklahoma. So the Comanches are in Texas, and they really ally with their former enemies and establish some specific trading relationships that are really built out of a desire to survive and out of cooperation. But as a result of this, they sort of expand their influence in Texas. Now, this post-independence Mexico is very unable, excuse me, very unable to continue their relationships with the Spanish authorities, where the Spanish would sort of pay the Comanches with gifts and bribes, and then the Comanches would not attack them. So the Comanche warriors immediately, once the Spanish government stops paying these bribes, is to attack the Tejano settlements. And the Comanches also, at this same time, begin to cultivate relationships with the New Mexico residents. So as they're doing this, they're attacking Mexican residents while undermining the influence of Mexico with residents in New Mexico. So we have disagreements over Texas, particularly where is the boundary. And this brings both the United States and Mexico into conflict. They send troops into these areas that are very undisputed. Most Americans were very much in support of expansion and also supported the war. However, some Americans did not support slavery and were vehemently opposed to it. So while some Americans did support acquiring more territory, increasing the influence of the United States, they didn't necessarily support slavery. So this will create some conflict as we're trying to decide how new states and new territories come into the larger union. The U.S. troops achieved victories in California and in Mexico along the Gulf Coast. Most soldiers were poorly equipped, and there were a lot of political divisions in Mexico, and so this leaves the Mexicans very vulnerable on the battlefield. So General Santa Anna, who has been newly restored to the presidency, refuses to admit that there has been any defeat on his part. He refuses to acknowledge any U.S. victories and attacks General Zachary Taylor's troops who are in the area. President Polk sends General Winfield Scott into this area, and his troops march directly into Mexico City. And the Mexican government, as a response to this, ousts General Santa Anna and pursues peace with the United States. So the United States does come in very forcefully and very aggressively. We, in 1848, reached the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the United States gives Mexico a certain amount of funds in exchange for control of Texas. Mexico is given $15 million from the United States, and as a result, they gain all territory in Texas north and east of the Rio Grande. They also acquire California and the New Mexican territory, which has not been part of the United States until now. So again, we have this conflict that takes place through this treaty negotiation in 1848. The United States acquires all of Texas, the New Mexico territory, and significant portions of California. So here, if you're looking, you can see all of California that comes into this particular area. This is given up by Mexico. We have this sort of disputed area in here, which we are fighting over, which will ultimately become part of the United States. We also have this eastern part of Texas as well, that will remain part of the United States. So if you recall from earlier in the semester, from about right here along this Mississippi, this is the original size of the United States. Then we'll increase that over here into this unorganized territory, which is part of that Louisiana Purchase. And then we'll eventually extend that all the way to California. This is really part of this concept of manifest destiny, where sort of as far as we can see land in the United States, it is ours as Americans. It is our right and our responsibility to claim this land, to settle this land, to colonize this land. Now, this area up here, this Oregon Territory, this will remain in dispute for a few more years, but ultimately the British will leave the Oregon Territory. As I've mentioned, the constant concern about new territory being added to the United States is when that territory becomes a state. Will it be a free state or a slave state? You may recall the Missouri Compromise, in which Missouri entered into the Union as a slave state and Maine enters the Union as a free state. This concept of compromise will be very important in the coming chapters. As we're really centering on this issue of slave state versus free state, what we're really talking about without saying it is whether or not slavery will exist in the United States or whether it will not exist in the United States. So, not surprisingly, the debates over slavery will continue to increase. The debate over slavery's expansion into this new territory begins almost immediately. And so we have to decide how this newly acquired territory will be divided. In 1846, the Wilmot Proviso is agreed to, which would have outlawed slavery. Let me back up. The Wilmot Proviso is proposed, which would outlaw slavery in any territory gained from Mexico. This, of course, is defeated immediately by the Senate because the Southerners obviously want to keep slavery in place, but there are also pro-slavery Democrats in the North. Excuse me. So this Wilmot Proviso offers a solution. It's very, very quickly rejected. So the issue of slavery's expansion will continue to be unresolved. And as it continues to be unresolved, we reach 1848. At a time when we have new territory, but we also have a presidential election. The Democratic candidate was Lewis Cass, who was an expansionist, and he argued that the settlers within each territory should be able to decide whether or not slavery should be there. So he fully supports expanding national borders, but he believes that individual residents of the state should decide what is best for their states. He is very much in support of this anti-federalist idea of ensuring that individual states retain autonomy. So in an attempt to gain and retain national support, the Whigs nominate General Taylor. Now, General Taylor, of course, is a Southern slaveholder. He is also a war hero, and so he is nominated for the presidency. Millard Fillmore is a Northerner who opposed the annexation of Texas, and he is nominated by the Whigs for the vice presidency position. And the hope here is that this ticket will be diverse enough to pull in those in the North who might support slavery, but not necessarily support the annexation of Texas, as well as, of course, Southerners who benefit the most from slavery. The Liberty Party hoped to expand their support, and so they begin to reinvent themselves, and they call themselves now the Free Soil Party. You want to make sure you know the Free Soil Party as well. So this Free Soil Party argues for the exclusion of slavery in all Western territories, and they choose Martin Van Buren to be their presidential nominee. Now, in making this bold statement that slavery should be excluded, not that states would be able to choose, but that slavery should be completely excluded from the Western territories, the Free Soil Party really makes slavery the unavoidable issue. They really force the other candidates to address the elephant in the room, if you will. Now we can't talk about it in very abstract terms. Van Buren's victory in New York State does take enough votes away from Cass to give Taylor the presidency. And this, of course, puts a slaveholder in the White House, a Southern slaveholder. Now, this third party does contribute to this victory of a Southern slaveholder. However, something important that is achieved by that we should not discount is that they're really going to force this issue of slavery. They're going to force candidates moving forward to address the issue of slavery. This type of move, this type of discussion will lead to men like Abraham Lincoln, who will begin to say, we have to make a decision. We can't have a divided nation. Okay, that wraps up chapter 10. If you have questions, please email me. Thanks.